With the recent events involving Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, the concept of how our data is collected, by whom, and how it is used is increasingly catching public attention. Modern technology has ushered in the ability for our every move to be tracked. With services like Facebook and Fitbit, we can allow our data to be collected by companies. Given the current climate on this issue, due to the Facebook allegations of misuse of data, it is important to understand that our data has a deeper meaning than random numbers as they appear on a spreadsheet. So today we sat down with Pegah Parci, UC San Diego's privacy officer, to talk about how we handle data and the responsibility of our research community to keep this data protected against misuse. I began by asking, what are the responsibilities of the privacy officer?
The privacy officer, the privacy office at any organization is responsible for making sure that the organization handles any personal data that it has appropriately throughout the entire data lifecycle. So from the time the data is collected to how it's used or shared until you're done with it. So whatever you do at the end, whether it's destroying the data, returning it from whence it came, or archiving it, data banking it, that entire life cycle is what we're concerned with. My job description just got a lot easier based on the Facebook congressional hearings this week, because now I can point to 10 hours worth of testimony and say that is exactly the thing that I do and the things that I'm concerned with and that a privacy office is concerned with. Why are you collecting particular types of data? What is it that you're doing with that data? Who are you sharing it with? And why are you sharing it with those entities? That's exactly what I'm concerned with. So thank you, Mark Zuckerberg.
Privacy and data are currently in the spotlight. But how does this personal data issue translate to someone's day-to-day work in a university environment?
So let's talk a little bit wider than research admin and talk about all of the personal data that we have here on campus. So not only do we have student data, we have employee data, we have patient data, and we have research participant data that we're handling. Some of our researchers have data from the general public. They get things like census data, food stamp data, Uber data that they do research on. So we have a ton of personal information of varying degrees of sensitivity that we handle here on campus. So as an employee or as a student or as a researcher, we need to be really cognizant of why we are using the data that we're using and what it is that we're doing with it. If I am sharing data with my employer or with my university because they're providing me payroll services or they're supposed to educate me and they take that data and use it for research purposes, I have not consented to that, right? I have not consented to being a research subject, right? There is no informed consent. There is no IRB involved. And I don't know that they're doing that with me. So again, thinking back to the Facebook example, that's similar to what happened there. People had not consented to their data being used in the way that it was used. So here, just because you have access to particular types of data, if you're, for example, an instructor and you have a class roster or you have information about your students, that does not mean that you can then use that information to conduct a research study or that you can share that information with others that have no need to know that information. So on a day-to-day basis, just being cognizant of the types of data that you have access to and what you're authorized to do with it can take you a long way in privacy world.
As Pegah was explaining how data influences day-to-day work, I couldn't help but notice that there seems to be an interest in the intent of data collection. So I asked how this intent might affect the appropriate use of data.
That's right. So what we call that in privacy world is purpose specification and purpose limitation. The purpose for which I have the data, I should specify it to you, to the data subject. I should let you know why I'm collecting this data. And then I should limit my use of the data to those purposes and be as transparent as possible given the limitations.
So I was curious, is all the data treated the same?
No, different laws apply to different data. But let me back up a little bit, and if I can be very boring and give a quick history lesson. Privacy and data security laws are relatively new over the last 30 years around the world. So every day they are changing. There are new ones springing up every single day, whether it's a new state that wants to pass a privacy law, or the federal government is considering it for a particular sector, or another country is passing a new data security law. So it's sort of an ever-changing landscape that we've seen over the last 30 years. And if you think about a law that was passed in 1990 or 1995, and think about the way that the world has changed since 1995, right? Facebook didn't exist. Twitter didn't exist. Big data wasn't a thing yet, the way that it is now. Right now, you can instantaneously have access to such a large database, so many large databases instantaneously with the click of a button. You didn't have that in 1990 or 1995, at least to the level that you have now. The laws are trying to catch up with technology and the way that the world has changed. So different laws are being passed all the time. That being said, different countries also deal with privacy differently. So most other countries have what we would call a comprehensive privacy or data protection law, such that they say if anyone, handles any kind of personal data for whatever reason, here are the things that apply to you. Here in the US, we have what we call a sectoral approach to privacy, which means we have one law that applies to healthcare. We have one law that applies to students. We have another one that applies to your credit cards and one that applies to your credit information. Banking, we have different sectors, different industries have their own privacy and data security laws, whereas the rest of the world doesn't. So when you ask that question, going back to answer your question, which is everything treated the same? Well, kind of depends on the context, which makes privacy for the non-privacy person very frustrating. Sometimes people will ask me, well, I have email address and ethnicity of someone. Is that protected? And I have to say, well, that depends. I need more context. I need to know whose is it? Where is it coming from? What are you doing with it? Because I need to know, does this belong to someone from the European Union? Because then a different law might apply to it and it needs to be protected slightly differently. Is it of a California resident? Is it of someone that's under the age of 13? Those all will affect the level of sensitivity. So that makes it a complicated and scary sounding world. So I tell people not to worry too much in those types of nuances, but just to be aware of any time that they are handling personal information about another human being, another individual, have a little flag raised to say, am I collecting more than I really need for my purposes? Am I sharing it in an appropriate way? Am I sharing it with someone that has a need to know? Am I limiting the time that I keep this data? Can I de-identify this data and still use it for the purposes that I'm trying to use it for? So just keeping those in mind will really help you meet most privacy and data protection regulations and regimes, right? Or at least it'll get you a good ways there without you having to become some kind of privacy expert. Now, if you do know that you're handling something that is regulated, if you know I, for whatever reason, am handling social security numbers, or I'm handling substance use information, you already know that's sensitive. You can always go to your local privacy officer or your local information security officer and talk to them about any particular things that you need to have in place. For example, some laws will require you to have very particular things in your consent language. right? And this is a little bit different than your research-informed consent. This is consent to use your data, to collect and use your data in a particular way. And some laws will require you to be explicit in the way that you describe things. So you can always talk to your privacy officer and they can help you with that.
There seems to be a complex set of policies about how to deal with different data sets, which led to the question, how can a research administrator support their PI and steer them in the right direction of how to handle their data?
The research administrators and PIs already have so much on their plates. So, like I said, I don't want anyone to feel overwhelmed by privacy or security. I don't want them to feel like they need to know all the nuances. I just want them to be aware, to raise the flag, and ask the question early. So if you can, at the earliest phases of research design or proposal development, to at least flag in your own head that we're collecting individual personal data from people. Keeping that in mind and asking your privacy officer early if you need to, that is really key for the research administrator. I think that based on the things that have happened in the last couple of years, the large privacy data breaches that have happened, especially last year with things like Equifax, and again, this year with Facebook, the average person is becoming more and more conversant and more concerned about privacy and what it is that is happening with their data. So one thing I would ask researchers is to always keep in mind that this may be just a data element to you, or it may be a data set to you. That is still somebody's data. So if you do have personal information about someone, think about what would happen if that data were to be compromised in some way or to be misused in some way. That's not something you want to see on the front page of a newspaper. And as people become more concerned about these things, they will really pay attention and will read your consent documents a little bit more carefully, especially if you are gathering sensitive data about them. So I've actually seen research participants that do want to be a part of a trial, but because of the sensitivity of the data and the fact that they don't get answers to their security questions, that they won't participate in something. So it really ends up hurting the research if people are, self-selecting out because they don't feel that you're going to protect their privacy sufficiently. And researchers like to gather as much data as they can just in case there's something cool that they can discover out of it. And they like to share with a lot of people as much as they can. They like to collaborate, and we want to encourage that. We want to encourage collaboration cross-institutional with all of your other researchers around the world. We want to encourage that, but we want to make sure that we do that responsibly and take care of our research participants. The last thing we want is for you to have collected a ton of really cool data that you can use for really interesting research and then find out that you can't use it because you didn't get the appropriate consent, or somebody has a problem with the method that you collected it, or you don't have sufficient security around it, so somebody else was able to gain access to it, so now it's useless. So what we want to do is make sure that you have the sufficient knowledge to protect it in the early stages, to use it for the appropriate things, so that nothing gets in the way of your research, right? So that's kind of what my role is here, to help the university do.
At this point, I was intrigued about how privacy and collection can coexist in a university environment.
The great thing about generalizable knowledge is that a lot of the analysis can happen with de-identified or aggregate or anonymized data, right? So it can be that when you collect data, you need some of the personal identifiers, but once you get to the stage where you're analyzing it or sharing it or doing more general stuff with it, that you don't need to keep the identifiers. So it's very easy. And you don't want to have those identifiers anyway. It makes your data set more sensitive. It restricts whether or not you can share it with other people. So if you get rid of certain identifiers, it may make it a lot easier for you to share with your collaborators around the world and not run afoul of any laws. So we do encourage that as much as possible because it helps your research.
Pegah raised an interesting point about how long we keep data. So I asked, how can RAs learn about managing data over time?
We do have record retention guidance and policies here at UC. So always consult with those first. If there is no guidance on it, which is rare, then the basic best practice is keep things for as long as you need them and no longer. But there are laws that say you must keep certain data for certain amounts of time. FDA regs in particular tell you need to keep something for this long so we can validate. After that, get rid of it. But always consult with your record retention schedules, either campus-based, department-based, or UC-based. So I would point people there first. What you don't want to do is to finish your research, have a ton of paper files, ship them off to some paper storage facility, and then forget about them. You don't want to do that. So yes, you should be cognizant of the retention schedules. And if you, as is appropriate for much of the research world, if you do need to do data banking or archiving, things like that, most of that is done after you de-identify the data so that it's no longer at all able to be connected with an individual. And it keeps much of its utility, right? And in that case, you can share with the rest of NIH. You can put it in dbGaP. You can put it wherever the great data banks are and maintain the utility without causing any privacy concerns. I'm going to back up and talk about this very quickly. Most people are, I think, much more afraid of their digital data they have on their computers, and they're worried about things being hacked and ransomware and phishing attacks, those sorts of things. But you should know that at least in the healthcare setting, paper documents are where the biggest risk is because people don't keep track of paper very well. You can't easily run reports on it very well to know where they are. People take paper all over the place and they ship them off to some storage facility, forget about them, and then 20 years later, someone says, what is all this? What are all these boxes? So keep in mind that just because you're done with your research and you don't care about that document anymore or that data anymore, that still belongs to an individual. That is still somebody's blood information. That is still somebody's data from their fitness app, whatever it is that you collected. That still belongs to somebody else. That is someone's data. Just because you no longer need it doesn't mean that it loses its sensitivity.
And finally, our very own privacy officer gave us insight on how modern technologies and third-party gadgets collect and use data.
The big thing these days is to use fitness trackers and various wearables and devices that collect a ton of data and store it in the cloud somewhere or with some external third party that is not a research entity. You should be aware that those entities and their relationship with data is different than your relationship with data. So, for example, if you're using some kind of watch, some sort of wearable device that belongs to some third-party company, right? They monetize that data. They wheel and deal in that data. They might sell that data. Whatever it is that they do to data, they, just by their nature, have a different relationship to the data that they collect than a researcher does or a research university does. We have particular kinds of obligations to our research subjects and to anyone whose data that we're collecting in a way that that third party may not. That's not to say that they don't have good security. They might. But if you are going to use third parties, especially with industry, that collect data through an app or a device, that is something that you should flag and definitely talk to, at the very least, talk to your information security about, to make sure that everything is on the up and up and that data is not being sold and wheeled and dealed in inappropriate ways.
I must say, this was one of the most interesting and valuable conversations that we had. It had a lot of personal applicability and a lot of professional applicability. Some of the key takeaways were that you don't have to be a privacy expert in order to understand some basic appropriate use of data. And another thing that was important was that the data we collect belongs to someone. So the concepts like intent and usage are very important. And in fact, by protecting data and data privacy, it can actually help academic pursuits. Thanks for joining us today for the UC San Diego RA Training Program podcast. We'd also like to thank Pegah Parci for sitting down with us. And always thank you to our invaluable training assistant, Francisco Mejia, for his production and editing expertise. Be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Or you can visit our website, trainra.ucsd.edu, where you can find links to our social media, sign up for our listserv, and get more information about the program.